Hi, I'm Roxy from Yahoo UK, and this is Origin Story. Today I'm talking with Charlie Higson. He's a writer, comedian, and podcaster. Welcome to Origin Story, Charlie. Lovely to meet you.
Lovely to be here.
I wanted to ask you first of all, the start of your podcast, of course.
Right.
And first of all, I wondered, how did your love of history first begin, and why did you want to make a podcast around the British monarchy?
I grew up and first went to school in the 1960s, and history was taught very differently then. It was in a way that it now is considered quite old-fashioned. It was a very narrative approach. It was kings and queens, battles, great men, inventions. And it was, you would start at the Romans and kind of move forward through Anglo-Saxon and then through the monarchs. And at the time, I learnt a rhyme as a way of remembering all the British monarchs from William the Conqueror to Elizabeth I. Sorry, second. I'm not that old. Elizabeth II was on the throne. And the rhyme is Willy, Willy, Harry, Steve, Harry, Dick, John, Harry, 3, 1, 2, 3, Ned's, Richard, 2, etc. And it sort of stuck with me, and I found it very interesting when my kids went to school that history now is taught very, very differently. You get sort of intense studies of different bits of history, like the Egyptians and American Civil Rights Movement, the Romans, the Tudors. And so they know a lot about those things, but they don't necessarily know in what order those things happened and how we got from one to the other. Because it is this extraordinary story, and I've, being a dad, I do a lot of dad-splaining to the kids, and I realise that most people younger than me don't have that narrative thread through history. And for a few years I've been doing events at a fantastic history festival in the Chalk Valley, where I host a kind of comedy history quiz, but also been doing talks, and people seem to have enjoyed my talks, and like everybody else in COVID, I thought maybe I should start a podcast. But it was a couple of years before I got round to it. And my final impetus was the coronation of King Charles III. Because there was a lot of talk about the monarchy and why is this man on the throne? What right has he got to be our king? And a lot of people talking about the history of the monarchy, and most people didn't really know much about it. So I thought that was a perfect time to launch it for the coronation.
Let's go to your life, your career,
yes.
And everything. And I wanted to start first of all with your comedy beginnings, because that was obviously your early start. And I wondered, when did you kind of first realise that comedy was your calling?
My calling? Gosh. I mean, it was never a career move. Being at school in the 60s and 70s, you weren't taught media studies or anything like that. The idea of a career in the media, in TV, in comedy was not something that crossed my mind. But when I went to university in the late 70s, I met a few people who sort of altered the course of my life, I suppose. One of them was Paul Whitehouse. Another one was Harry Enfield. He wasn't at university with me, but his best friend was. And likewise, Vic Reeves. So I met all of those people at that time in my life. But back then, for me, in the late 70s, if you wanted to kind of show off to your mates and arse about on stage and try and get off with girls, you formed a band. It being 1977, my first band was a punk band, and then I went on to another band called the Higsons, which was a sort of scratchy indie white funk band. And so when I left university, I did that for a few years as a singer, but I kept in touch with Paul and Harry and Vic Reeves, and I saw this very interesting trajectory that, okay, comedy was a thing you could do. Harry, being that much younger than us, he had started to do it at comedy. He had a double act. Started to do it at university. He had a double act there. And Vic Reeves was kind of plugging away at the circuit and getting a name for himself. So It started because Harry needed people to write material for him. So Paul and I, we were living close to each other in Hackney, and I'd always been a writer. I'd enjoyed writing, so I'd managed to save up to buy an early Amstrad computer. Terribly, terribly clunky things. Kids today, they don't know what it used to be like. And I had that, and basically Paul said to me, look, I want to write some stuff with Harry. You've got a word processor and I haven't. Let's do it together. And we'd always made each other laugh. And I had the discipline of being a writer, and he was a great performer and mimic, great at doing characters and voices, and we really liked doing that. So we started writing for Harry, and we started doing little bits of performance for Vic Reeves on some of his, doing the big night out before it was on the television.
You know, obviously you enjoyed some success with the Higsons, which I think is a different band to your punk band.
Yes, the punk band didn't last very long. In the proper spirit of punk, it kind of imploded within a year. Mainly because most of the rest of the band were thrown out of university, including Paul, for not doing any work. But, you know, I mean, the great thing about university is it's not so much about the degree you get or the academic side. I mean, it can be if you want to be a doctor or a lawyer or something, but you know, I was doing English and American literature and film. What was so fantastic about it is the people you meet and the connections you meet, and all those people go on to do interesting things, and your kind of lives intersect as you go through.
Yeah, for sure. And I wondered, you know, was there a specific band that kind of influenced the Higsons and the music that you made with them?
Although we vehemently denied it at the time, we were very much trying to be the English Talking Heads. And in interviews we'd say, no, we're nothing like them. But looking back, we were trying so hard to be like them.
And obviously, speaking of music in more general terms, I wondered kind of what was the first single or album that you bought?
I was a slightly nerdy teenager. I thought of myself as being above pop music. So I used to listen to a lot of classical music and jazz and a lot of world music. The first album, I think the first album I actually bought with my own money was a Fats Waller album. So make of that what you will.
Okay. I love it. And I wonder if you could choose one song to define your life, which would it be and why?
God, to define my life? I mean, all the songs I really love tend to be the ones which are so far removed from my life, which is kind of why I liked to listen to them. I mean, you know, when I was in the 70s, my older brother had the first Velvet Underground album, and I used to listen to that obsessively, particularly the track Waiting for the Man, because I was in a little sort of commuter town in Kent. I had a very nice life, but it was quite straight and quite dull in many ways. So listening to these songs about weird people in Manhattan buying drugs and having strange sex seemed like an impossibly glamorous world out there, but I kind of aspired to getting out of Sevenoaks and into the wider world, and I ended up in Norwich, which again was probably even further from Lou Reed in Manhattan. But I mean, it doesn't define my life on any level, but it defines, I suppose, my aspirations of wanting to be in a bigger, more exciting, more glamorous world.
And I wanted to ask you about Young Bond, of course,
yes.
your wonderful book series. And I wanted to ask, obviously, you had great success with that, and also on His Majesty's Secret Service. And I wondered, you know, how did you first get into Bond?
Well, the first film that I remember going to see in the cinema when I was quite a small boy was Thunderball in the early 60s. And I remember being absolutely blown away by it. You know, I'd sort of seen things on TV with sort of old-fashioned types of heroes, but James Bond was this completely new type of hero, as far as I concerned, who did some terrible things, and I thought that was quite interesting. And, you know, as soon as that opening music came on, the Bond theme, and he turns and fires at the camera, I just thought, this is just amazing. I mean, again, going back to what I was talking about being taken into a bigger, more glamorous world. I mean, you can't do better than James Bond for that. And And so, yeah, you know, for me, going to the cinema in the 60s was going to see James Bond films. And then later on, as I started to read a lot of crime books and thrillers, I thought, well, I really ought to get around to reading the Ian Fleming James Bond books. And so I made my way through them. And so, yeah, I've always been a big James Bond fan. And then gosh, it's about 20 years ago now, well, actually, I'll just backtrack a little bit, because in the early 90s, I started writing my own crime books. I wrote four crime books in the early 90s. And I had a fantastic editor called Kate Jones. And at least 10 years later, she approached me and said, I've got a new job now. I'm not in publishing, I'm working for the Ian Fleming estate. And they very much want to remind the world that James Bond started with Ian Fleming.
You obviously got to write the 007 book for King Charles's coronation.
Yes.
And I wondered, what was that experience like?
Well, it was quite interesting, because when the Fleming estate first approached me back in the day and said, we're looking at someone to write some new James Bond books, they didn't say at that point that it was young Bond immediately. And my initial reaction was, God, where would you start doing a new adult Bond that hasn't been done in all Fleming's books, in all the other continuation novels, in all the films? And they said, no, this is young Bond. And as I say, oh, there was room for me. But having done that and written the young Bond series, and so totally immersed myself in the world of James Bond and Ian Fleming, I was kind of itching to do an adult one. I had to wait for Anthony Horowitz to finish, to get out of my way. But it all came together very quickly for the coronation. This year, 2023, is it's the 60th anniversary of the publication of Casino Royale, the very first James Bond book. And also, this is the first time that the Fleming estate, Ian Fleming Publications, are publishing all of Fleming's books themselves. So they've just relaunched a whole beautiful new collection with new covers, and so it's a big year for them. And they approached me and said, look, you know what we're doing, because I've been involved in some of their events. They said, we've also realised that it is 60th anniversary of On Her Majesty's Secret Service, and there is a coronation coming up. This is back in February. And they said, we want to do something for the coronation. We want to do a charity book, and all we've got is a title, On His Majesty's Secret Service. And so they wanted a contemporary Bond story that had something to do with the coronation. And they were looking at doing it with two of the royal charities, with Prince's Trust and with Camilla's new literacy charity, the Queen's Reading Room. So they said, probably best not to do a story about trying to disrupt the coronation or assassinate King Charles, at which point I said, come on, that's got to be the story. You're not going to come up with a better story than that. And they said, oh, right. But I only had a month to do it, so they said, you know, probably it would be a short story of some sort, and we'll pad it out to make it a thing. And it's for charity, so people would be a bit more charitable towards it. But when I started writing it, I had all these years of James Bond and the adult Bond sort of stored up inside me, waiting to come bursting out, like James Bond in an Aston Martin. And I started writing it, and I kept ringing them up saying, I think this might be a bit longer than, because they'd originally said about 8,000 words. And eventually it ended up as a kind of short novel. It's about 45,000 words. I wrote it in a month. We turned it around in a couple of weeks, doing all the sort of copy editing. 2 weeks in a printer's, and then it was in the shops 2 days before the coronation. So it was fabulous, because we managed to sort of get in on all the coronation stuff. So all the bookshops were doing kind of like book displays for the coronation, and James Bond on His Majesty's Secret Service was the perfect one to put in there. And it was also that I was launching my Monarchs podcast, so it all fed in. And in fact, the research that I'd been doing for the podcast made it into the book, because it's about someone claiming they have a greater right to the throne than Charles has.
What were the movies that you loved growing up, and do you remember your first cinema trip?
I went to see Thunderball at a very young and impressionable age. I loved going to see James Bond films. I mean, in the 60s also there were some great Disney films. Jungle Book was a perennial favourite. God, so yeah, Disney, James Bond, any sort of adventure films I loved. War films, knights, people fighting, that kind of stuff.
All the thrillers.
Yes.
And what was the first film to make you cry?
First film to make me cry, it's probably The Jungle Book. There's a bit at the end where Baloo the bear, this is a big spoiler here, appears to die. And I remember thinking as a child, that's a bold move from Disney. But of course, you know, lots of Disney characters die in the films, particularly the early ones. You know, Bambi has traumatized generations of children. So, you know, Baloo is apparently dead. There's rain pouring all over everybody, so it looks like the whole world is crying. And yes, I cried. And then he came back to life. And I cried even more. I tend to cry at the happy things in films more than the sad things. When people are nice to each other and that kind of thing. When things work out well for people, that makes me cry more than people dying. But particularly, like, you know, that was another film I went to see when I was young. Yeah, Where Eagles Dare, where Clint Eastwood manages a massive body count by using 2 machine guns at the same time, one in each hand. So yeah, lots of people died in that and didn't make me cry.
Was there anyone in your life or career you would say had a defining influence on you?
Well, obviously the people I met way back through university, Paul Whitehouse, Harry Enfield, Vic Reeves, but actually probably the person that had the most effect in terms of my learning stuff and knowing how to do things was probably, I think, the greatest television comedy producer of all time, a guy called Geoffrey Perkins, who I first worked with when we did Saturday Night Live. Before that, he'd started in radio, and he'd been behind things like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and a lot of those big hits. He was also involved in Spitting Image and Saturday Night Live. He was the producer on Harry's sketch shows. And so, you know, I went in as a unqualified, not that there's any way you can be a sort of qualified comedy writer, but, you know, this whole world was new to me. And he was very generous with his time and with his advice, because, you know, a lot of people in that world, you know, it's like, we don't want writers around, they're just annoying, keep trying to tell us, oh, you're doing it wrong. And they keep you at arm's length. But he said, no, I like writers. And he sort of took me under his wing. And so I learned everything there was to know about making a comedy show, making a sketch show, and producing a sketch show. And, you know, I would sit with him in the gallery when we were shooting the show. And, you know, he allowed me in the edit and everything. And he had a very, very strong and clear ideas about it. You know, he was very good he was always trying to find new people and nurture them and train them up, and that was what he loved more than anything. And he was very good at spotting new talent. You know, he was involved with the royal family, with Catherine Tate, with loads of things, and it was only for having worked with Geoffrey that Paul and I felt able to produce the Fast Show, which we did. Never having actually produced anything before, the BBC said, okay, you know, if Geoffrey thinks you can do it, then do it. Because he wasn't available, he was our first choice. So, you know, it was because of him that we ended up being able to make the Fast Show in the way that we did. And then sort of every comedy thing I worked on, he was involved in some way in an advisory capacity. And then, unfortunately, he died very suddenly. It was about 10 or 15 years ago now. And and I've looked back and I've realised I haven't really made any comedy since he died, because I did rely very much on his advice.
But if you could go back in time and give young Charlie any advice to change his origin story, what would it be and why?
Well, I have a tendency towards smugness, and you know, I've been amazed at how nicely things have worked out without any planning through my life. I've met some fantastic people. I've been able to work on some very funny shows and to make people laugh, which is a brilliant thing to do. And I've written books that I've loved writing, and you know, everything has gone well. So I would probably go back and say, don't make any plans, don't change anything, just let things happen to you.
Well, thank you so much, Charlie.
Well, it's been great fun talking about myself.